Thank you. Let's see. So yeah, as mentioned, I'm Radoslav Stankov. I come from Bulgaria. It's located over here. Uh, I'm going to show a lot of code in my slides. So usually I just notice like happening things like that when I present, like just taking the pictures. So I already have them in here. So yeah, you don't need to like rush it because I would switch stuff. So as mentioned, I used to be the head of engineering at Product Hunt, and this was the Product Hunt architecture. Because Product Hunt was a social app, you needed like a very interesting and fat front end. We used Ruby, we used Ruby on Rails, we used the GraphQL Ruby gem, we used the GraphQL Apollo, and this was like a really good architecture for a product like Product Hunt. While I was at Product Hunt, I started this thing called Angry Building, which is a SaaS tool for facility managers. I mean, the goal of the company is to rename the company Happy Building and everybody to be happy, but we have to start from somewhere. So we started from Angry side. And it started as a side project, something which I worked on in the weekends. And very initially, I decided to have the most simple for me architecture I can get away with. So this means using Ruby on Rails. This involved a lot of JavaScript. Even though I like JavaScript, it can make the stuff a bit more complicated. So I decided like no JavaScript. I like CSS a lot, but I didn't want to think about class names. To naming is hard, and if I can avoid it, I try to avoid it. So I decided to use Tailwind. Because this was a business application, I had extensive end-to-end test suite, and the biggest focus was on the domain logic because, again, business applications. So I love Ruby, I love Rails, but in every Rails application, there is like a dark corner. One is called the helpers folder, and the other one, I mean, it's darker because it's kind of intertwined with the view logic. It's called partials. And in a lot of our projects, when I have to imagine how it's going to look like how this folders looks like, I imagine something like this. We start just pulling out strings of like the partials. Like how many of you have been in situations where I go to a view and I click one partial, then the other. Then for some reason, the first partial is included in the second one for some reason, and there is like double logic. So this was something I was not very happy about. Yeah, the UI would be not simpler, but I wanted my life to be simpler. So in 2020, GitHub released this component, this gem, which is named ViewComponents. And it's a very simple concept. You just write normal classes for components, and you can just create view components, and this can help you encapsulate things. And the good thing about that is I didn't need to make this extra thing like presenters, decorators, and actually figure out what's the difference between the decorator and presenter. And yeah, I started using this library, and my talk today is going to be some of the things I learned. But before we go to the things I learned, let's just give like a quick overview, like what's the view component library and how it can be used in the real world. So if you think about this very simple UI, it's like a field set for a form, and this component that represents the field set can just have the title and the content. Like it has two elements that can be configured and they can be used. So how it's going to be used in the view layer, we just have this render field set component. We initiate it, we passed like the title, and it has some content. And how is this using? It has a field set with a title, and it inherits from this view component base class, and you can create a HTML view that ties to this component. And here you are just giving the title, and you have this magical variable content, which is basically the captured value of the block that's given to the component. And this is one of the most powerful features of the library, which I'm going to give a lot of examples of. But having this component, it's actually very simple. It just encapsulates this logic. And because, again, this is the Ruby community and we care about tools and things like developer experience, the View component gem comes with like this preview system where you can very easily define previews, like very similarly how in Rails we have the action mailers that they can have previews. We just generate a simple preview class. There is an extra gem that is called Lookbook, where when you have a preview, you have this whole tool that you can actually preview and test your components. And it works just by installing a simple gem. Like when I was doing a lot of React work, setting up the tools in the React world called Playbook that has the same functionality took me like a week just to make it work, and like 3 hours per month just to keep it going. With this thing, I just set it up and it works out of the box. And right now, you guys, we just achieved, like, you are now a Vue component experts. That's pretty much the whole library. That's basically the most how it's going to use. If you know that, you can just start using it, and that's all great. And my talk is done in like less than 5 minutes. But let's go a bit deeper. Like when I started using it, like just with the basic knowledge, it took me a lot of time. But over time, I noticed that there is a lot of questions flying around. Like, what should be in the helper? Because should I stop using helpers? Just no. Should I remove partials? What should be a partial? What should be a component? It's like a very tricky balance. And with everything developer related, the best answer is depends. So I have this mental checklist where I decide what should go into a Vue component, what should go into a partial, what should go into a helper function. So I use the Vue component where I'm considering to have a partial that's used in at least 2 controllers. Like often when I see like this partial is used from this controller, this partial is used from this controller, that means that's like domain logic, that's like cross boundary. So this definitely goes to a component. If I'm having a Vue helper that generates HTML, usually the Vue helper code is nice, but when you start generating HTML in Vue helpers, it becomes tricky, especially if you try to think about security and not leaking HTML. Also, I noticed that when I have deep complicated logic, like I have deep if else based on like one domain object entity or something like that, and I just put this in a component where I can actually do like private methods, split the logic, make it a bit more readable. Also, when I connect stuff with JavaScript, like even though like I try to write as little JavaScript as possible, I'll write the ones that I actually need. And that I usually extract it in a component where I know it's like safe and sound there and I don't need to worry about it. When I don't use Vue components, and the first place I don't use it is for a partial named underscore form. I think most of you have ever created the underscore form. Yeah, it's just a form used in like a new and edit action. So if you just have a partial that's used in like the same controller, it's mostly form, to be honest, it's just a partial. Or if I have a Vue helper that's just a pure function, which is, example is format money. Like my software works with money. So I have a function called format money. And this is just a simple function. It gets the money object and it renders it in like locales and things like that. Also, there's another, this is a bit controversial, but I kind of like it, is if I have a page with a lot of HTML, like a lot of HTML, and a lot of that is, for example, needed for the UI or something like that, I just leave it there. Like, I try to make the messy code stay messy until I can actually find like a proper abstraction and make it easier to refactor. I don't try to like split it into like 20 partials just because the initial one would read better. I try to split to partials when there is like a logical reason to do so. Because it's very hard to spot duplications when you have to open like 10 files to see the duplication. It's a lot easier, for me at least, to just have like a big monitor with like a big scroll. And the way I think about those, like I have this mental image of having the helpers functions that are just like processing data. They go into the things which I call the UI components. And by UI components, I mean the button. I mean the core components that just do UI. They don't have anything about your domain. They don't have your logic. And they combine into the domain component. They combine into something that's related to your business logic. So example of this is I have the method format money. It is used by the money component because the money can be colored. Like if it's negative money, it's red. If it's green, it's like green, it's positive. And I have a component which shows the product price. If you just give it a product, it will check its price. It might get, for example, if there is discounts and things like that. So it combines this. And this is something I found like a nice mental framework to think about UI components in general. This is even a logic I used in the React world, where I just split the components into like something for the UI and something for the domain. But yeah, talk is cheap, and let's see some code. Like, let's go a bit deeper into like, again, how the stuff I used is. So the first thing I did with the view components is it kind of didn't read very nice to me to have this render component with initiating. So I created my helper function, which is just called component, and it uses this convention over configurations tree system where I just call render, I get the class, I classify it, I just pass through all the components. It just reads nicer just to see component, 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 component. And at least for me, it works nice. I mean, it's not something, if you like it, you like it. If you don't, it's your choice. And when you see my examples, I'm just going to use component because it kind of has this nice, evenly structure, like having this all lowercase stuff with underscores and don't have to think about like clicking shift and up. So let's see an example of like a bit complicated screen to see how it works. So this is a screen for my application. And this is a very common screen of my application because business software, you have all those areas. And if we split the areas into zones, I have a couple of zones. So I have, as you think about navigation, I have the page header, I have the stats, I have the table, and this is the areas of my layout. And if we just switch, those are the components. I have a navigation component, I have the page header component, I have the filter form component, I have the stats component, and I have the table component. And the code of the whole page is just like that. And as you see, it kind of fits on one slide. I mean, it's totally obvious. Everybody in the audience can see it. It's very like big, but again, technically correct. It fits on one slide, but let's break it down. Like, let's see it parts by parts. And I would start with this area. I would start with this component here, which is the stats component, because it's actually the most simpler and component from them all. So if we had the stats component, let's have this, let's zoom a bit and let's scroll to it. And this is the stats component. And the stats component is, as you noticed, I have my component stat. Oops, just a second. I need to just do like off of here. And if you notice here, I have the component stats, I have its numbers, so it gets like the title, the wallet amount, like it gets all those properties. So it uses one of my favorite features of view components. It's called slots. So the idea of the slot is that it treats your components to have slots. Like the host, when you can put another view components, another HTML, and just make your components a lot more reusable. Usually slots are very good for like a UI component because you want those components to be very configurable. So in this case, the slots component is, the stats component has this renders many numbers, and the numbers use the component stat component. Another thing I use here is render many uses this method called with numbers, which honestly for me doesn't read very well. It looks like, okay, I naturally don't say give me a stats like with number. For me, it's easier to just say number. So what I do here is I have this alias number with number. Just a lot of the times when I use those slots, I do an alias just to make the API a bit better. And also I can switch between using slot to using something else. Like this gives me some flexibility. Like I try to kind of hide this UI. Another thing I use in the view components is I have my root component, which is called the application component, where it's just like a grab bag of like a useful methods and things like that. And the component itself, I mean, this component per itself is very simple. It actually uses one of my favorite new Rails 3 era features like the _1. So it just loops through the numbers and just presents them. It's quite simple. The whole stat number component, as a lot of the UI components they have a lot of variables. They're like a very configurable on the layout side. So it just accepts title, amount, from, a color, because like the stats can be positive, negative, or meh, which is the gray one. So I have this, usually I notice this pattern where I have this hash of options, and in my application component, I have this function called fallback, fetch with fallback. So it uses the hash fetch function, which if it doesn't find the key, it blows up. But the problem with this is in production, I don't want my users to see 500, especially for a UI component. I mean, it's better in the UI to just show gray if you pass a number like pink that doesn't exist. So I have this object in my system. It's called error reporting. So error reporting can report errors to my exception tracking system. And in development and in test, this thing would blow up. So when I develop, I see an exception. When I run my tests, I see an exception. And when it's in production, people would see the default value. But I would start being picking with emails that the system is erroring out. So this is something that was very useful. It kind of reduces a lot of the noise. So yeah, that's basically this component. The other component, which is a bit more interesting, and it uses a pattern I haven't seen much in the ViewComponent documentation, is this component, which is my filter form. So if we scroll a bit to the filter form, it uses something which, I mean, I call it the builder pattern just because in Rails we have this form builder object, and I use the same pattern here. So I have a component. In this case is the form builder, which passes the form, and I have very simple, like in the Rails you have form search, form select, I have the date range. So I just have this very simple thing to just build forms and filter forms with all the params. And the code for that, it's not that complex. So it's still the nice same filter form component. It has an action, which is like which URL. By default is null if it goes to the same page. And it gets the params of the page, so it can match data and values. And it has this array of inputs, which is basically an array. I use this hack because, so content block is executed in two cases. It's executed when you use the content or when you have slots. If you don't have any of those two cases, the block is not being executed. If the block is not being executed, you cannot have these DSL-like builders. So often I mean, in those components, I just have like a before render callback, which is part of the view components that just renders this content. I mean, what can you do? That's life. So the other methods are just the helpers. So the first method is the search, the search. So it just presents like a search input with like a magnifying glass. And this is just an array or tuple like with a label and the HTML of another component, which is search input component. So search input is just like a component. It needs like 4 DOM elements just to render a magnifying glass. So I extracted it into a component and I just put it there. The other one, the select, is just a normal select tag. I have like options for select, I have some class names. So another thing here to notice, and this is a pattern that's very popular, we name these classes because like a class is a reserved word and you cannot like use a reverse reserved word because the compilers won't be happy. So a lot of stuff just uses classes. And here again, just render a select with its label. So I don't use slots here because honestly, it's just one HTML tag that's used in one component. I don't want to like because I have like, I mean, in this example, I'll show you like 4 fields, but I have like 5 more. I don't want to have like 5, 6 classes, which are all one-liners. And it's a lot simpler to just keep it here, like just keep the complexity near where the logic is. And the other one is I have this text, like just search for text. Because my application is internationalized, I have a lot of T helpers, which help me just have internalization. Like one of my T helpers is the T label, which gets a key. The key, if it's a string, just display it. That means it comes from somewhere logic. Otherwise, tries to translate it, use a default like label underscore. So in this way, I can say placeholder is money, and it can be translated in Bulgarian pari, and other languages money, or whatever is in the other languages. I just know two, human languages at least. So yeah, this is how it looks like. I have something called date range, which has like two fields, before date and after date. And the cool thing about this setup here is I have this API. And if I have to use this API, and let's say a fancy designer comes into my project someday and says, but I want these fancy JavaScript calendars. I can say, okay, I just changed one function. I just changed this function and I get a fancy calendars everywhere. If it's a lot fancy function, I can even extract a separate component, but the filter form doesn't need to know about it. Like I have this freedom of making this deferring like decisions and abstracting this later on. Like I have changed a lot of like the layout, the classes of a lot of those components over the time, but it was very simple because none of my view ever changed. I just used the helpers. And again, the form itself, just plain HTML, just the form tag. It loops through the inputs, it shows the label, again, wraps the label, so when you click on a label, it focuses the input. And yeah, that's it. It's a very useful pattern for having a lot of like the core components, the ones that build your system. Another interesting component with a bit of hackiness in it is this page header. So I mean, I'm a programmer, I like coder. So every page I have has the breadcrumb where the user can actually figure out where they are. It has like a title and it has this, I call it actions bar, and it's just stuff that's a button on the top. So how does this thing look like? So this is just like a component, which is like a page header. It has the breadcrumbs, it has header actions, and it has like another of my builder components. And where is my highlighter? So yeah, another one like action component has like menu action, and I just give it like a URLs. And this is just like a drop down with all the actions. Right now, because again, I didn't want to do any fancy menus, I just have like a select. But if I want to do anything fancy, like you wouldn't notice, like I don't need to change my API in order to have my select. So the page header component, it has two slots. One is the breadcrumb. So I have multiple breadcrumbs, and for breadcrumbs, I have like component, because if you give the domain objects, like for example, I give it a building, I have a button where you click all the button actions. If I give it apartments and other things. I again use the aliasing here for action slot. I don't like having something to go like with action slots. It looks a lot better just to say header actions and give it a block, a lot more symmetric. I have this title, and the title uses this, one of my armies who is T labels. Like it has this T display function for internalization, where if it's a symbol, try to translate it. If it's a string, just display it. And if it responds to display name, which is my protocol for internalizing, it's like how the objects are displayed, use that. And sometimes I had name and title and just display it. Also very useful when you do like internalization or like just controlling this. Another hack here is because the view components have access to the helpers, you can actually pass data back to content for. Like in the view in the Rails, we have the content for and yield in your layout. Like for example, when I set a title that's displayed in this page component, my HTML head title also becomes this value. I use this hack only in one place, which is this, but it's a nice thing to know if you kind of need to do something hacky to just pass data on the top level. Shouldn't be required very much. Again, I needed it only for the title because I wanted to say, okay, this is my page title and I want to match the title, but it's a nice hack. Like the breadcrumbs, they just have that, like just loop through the arguments, very simple. And I have something where if the title is not set, I just infer the page title based on like controller name, action name, resource name. Just again, because I use internalization here. Even if you don't use internalization, this might be very useful for your projects where you don't need to remember to always type stuff. It can just be inferred. And the component itself, again, it's not very complex. It's just a navbar with headers and with actions. Like, very kind of obvious here. And the final component of this page is my table component. And actually, this was the first component I started here because we need to show tables. Like business apps, we need tables. So the table here is this component. So I don't have a name for this pattern. I have no idea. Somebody might figure a better name here. But the idea here is I still have my component, which is the table. It gets like a result from like a search object, and it has the table. And this is like the configuration of the table. Like you can say, okay, I have a table which is a record. It uses the itself function. I have a record which is apartment. I have a record which is cashier. I have a date. I have some money columns. I have some actions, and all of those are just like configurations of the how each table row is going to look like. And when I loop through those, I kind of display it. Here, actually, there is an example of what I call the domain objects. Like I have transaction, for this is the table of the transactions, and the transaction kind batch uses internally the batch component, which is the UI, and the batch is just like a rounded colored thing. Like the transaction can be income or expense, so it's red or green, and things like that. Another thing here is I still use helpers, and for some things, like for example, buttons, to be honest, just writing every time component, button, and passing everything, it's kind of tedious. So just for buttons, I also have the view helpers. Like I think this is the only component, like buttons is kind of like the uniquest component of them all in terms of like usefulness, like everything is button, like. So for buttons, I made this exception where again I have in the modification helper all my 4 types of buttons, just have them list there. So by default, I can just render. It looks nicer. So again, helpers are still useful. I mean, I still have like I think 10 or 15 helpers, and they're all in the same application helper. But again, they are very simple. They're just one-liner, just a shortcut. So the table component itself, again, it's not very complex. It has two arrays. One, the records that's being received. The other is the columns. I have formatters, which are like 2 lambdas, which are formatting money, formatting date. I have my before render hack. And the whole thing here just uses like a column array, and it uses this class, which is called the table column. And it can have like a name. It can have a classes, like if I need to like configure each cell. It has some formatter because a lot of the cells I want to format them in. And I passed to the helpers, and helpers is basically the Rails view context helpers. So I can generate HTML from it, and I just pass through the block. And the whole helpers here, like the simple ones, like number, if it's a number, it just adds a class. So all the numbers are aligned on the right. So you can see the bigger, the smaller, so you can actually really scan it. The money, I mean, money is also numbers, but it has a special formatter. The date has a class of time, which maybe should be date. I don't know why it's named timed. And it formats the date. So for example, format date, if it's a time, it formats it in the proper timeline. A bit more complex is the record. Like record is, so I say one of my column displays a record, and I'm trying to use my tDisplay function to finally extract from the record how it should be presented to the user. And I have a helper that kind of links, shows you the link to the record. And that's kind of it. Like all those are the helpers. This is kind of, I have a couple of more helpers, but those are the ones that are kind of set up. And the table column itself is just a very simple class with two methods. One that renders the header, and the other one is just render the cell. The complex part here is this thing, like just capturing the block. It's a bit blobbly. It's not that bad, but that's what we can do. We just capture the block content. We clean it up, like strip and just have it as null, or just a second, or like if we have formatter and content, we format, and we just use the helpers tag to generate like another table. And the table code, is very simple as well. Like we just loop to the headers, we go to the records, we render each cell. If there is a pagination, I just have like a pagination. Like if it doesn't have pagination, I don't show anything. And yeah, this is one very kind of like a complex screen that kind of encapsulates a lot of the patterns that I use and the more kind of interesting components. Like I have at least 20 or 30 more components, which are like a lot more simpler than those, but those are the ones that I used in a lot of the application, like having forms to filter, having a table. So yeah, that's all for me. And thank you for your attention. And yeah, the slides will be over here. And if anybody has questions, I'll be like just wandering around.